Hello, my name is Gillian Lamb and the topic of today's paper is I Wish I Had Stayed in Canada When You First Sent Me, Institutionalised Children's Agency and Its Consequences. In 1867, 18-year-old Saxby Slater and his brother William decided to return from Canada. Taking ship in Quebec, after a long journey they landed in Greenock on Scotland's west coast. It was a decision they soon regretted. Quickly running out of money, the pair were forced to walk from Edinburgh to Newcastle, begging en route without much success. At Newcastle, half-starved and in desperation, they joined the army. Saxby and William were early examples of what would 10 years later become a key plank of British social policy, the migration of pauper, neglected and criminal children throughout the British Empire. Both boys had emigrated to Canada at the end of their time in England's largest reformatory school, the Royal Philanthropic School, or RPS for short. Given the option of returning home to London and poverty at the end of their sentence, or beginning their new life in a new country, the boys had opted to emigrate, Saxby in 1863 and William in 1867. Saxby and William were two of 1,761 boys from the RPS who emigrated between 1850 and 1900. Overall, 40% of the boys who left the school between 1850 and 1900 went overseas. My project follows 100 of them in detail as part of a larger piece of work which examines the life courses of 210 children, boys and girls, who spent time in two residential institutions in Surrey in the second half of the 19th century. While the bigger project, as I said, considers boys and girls, it was principally boys who emigrated. This paper, therefore, concentrates just on the boys. Reformatory and industrial school children were an important part of child and juvenile migration in the second half of the 19th century. Yet they've been overlooked in the scholarship of child welfare, which is focused principally on the work of other philanthropic institutions such as Barnardo's and the Waifs and Strays. Yet reformatory and industrial school children accounted for 12% of child emigration between 1858 and 1914, and an even larger proportion prior to 1870, perhaps as much as 2/3. Adding these children into our analysis, therefore, is essential if we're to understand the impact of child welfare on late 19th century life. It is also important for our understanding of the British world. As a part of the settler migration that characterised 19th century Britain, the young people who went overseas took part, as Laura Ishiguro has said, in the making and remaking of Britain's empire. Over the last decade, imperial historians have highlighted that emigration is fundamental to our understanding of the modern world. There are increasing calls to understand what motivated an estimated 1 million people to leave Britain in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Calls to regard emigrants as active agents rather than passive victims of circumstance. This paper argues that we should be extending this demand to our consideration of the 19th century child migrant. Child emigration schemes have been much critiqued in the scholarship, and historians have understandably concentrated on the emotional harm that they caused. A focus on Barnardo, the highest profile child philanthropist, has influenced the historiographical narrative. Barnardo was blatant in his disregard for the rights of parents to control their children's futures. His prosecution on over 80 occasions for not following the laws and consent has driven a perception that most children were emigrated without parental agreement or knowledge. Joy Parr, whose 1980 work remains the definitive account of migration to Canada for children, described the child migration schemes as more like British transportation and indentured service policies of the 17th and 18th centuries than the private and voluntary population movements of the 19th and 20th. Child migrants, like adult migrants, have been portrayed as helpless victims of misguided imperialistic policies. Yet, as this paper argues, this was not the case for the boys in the RPS. Instead, as the following examples will show, boys from the RPS engaged with ideas of emigration and chose to emigrate voluntarily. They also chose to come back when the ideas they had did not measure up to reality. Although my thesis has not studied in detail the case files of all 1,761 boys who emigrated between 1850 and 1900, a review of 500 files reveals no instances of boys emigrating involuntarily. This corresponds with the analysis regarding consent carried out by Michelle Langfield with respect to the Middlemore homes in Liverpool. Staff at the RPS sought parental consent where necessary, and in many cases where it was not. The school despaired of parents and children who failed to see the opportunity that emigration offered. describing their objections as mistaken and unreasoning. Nonetheless, they generally acceded to parents' wishes and allowed boys to return home, even if they believed, as they said, that boys had thrown away a chance that they will never get again, of which no amount of parental or family promises of plenty of work can compensate. When parents did consent, it was normally because they felt that there was no opportunity for their children in England. Emigration was an alternative to poverty. 15-year-old Benjamin Hill from Maidenhead in Berkshire emigrated in 1874 because his 53-year-old father, an agricultural labourer and father of 12 living children, wrote he would rather that Benjamin emigrated. The local minister, Reverend Graiseley, whose opinion was also sought, agreed that there was no opportunity in Maidenhead for Benjamin. Similarly, in 1884, 20-year-old George Wood's mother said that she wished him to emigrate as there was no opening at home. George's mother may have had an alternative motive. George had entered the RPS in part because of his conviction for burglary, but in part also because he was said by the local chief constable to be uncomfortable at home, frequently beaten by his stepfather and turned out of doors. George's stepfather, an iron roller in the dockyard at Chatham in Kent, was reported to be an intemperate character who ill-treated his wife. Perhaps the lack of opening at home referred to an absence of physical and emotional space for George rather than merely employment. Sometimes there was a mismatch between the wishes of parents and the child. Children over the age of 16 could consent to their own emigration, and there are some cases in the records that show that they did so in defiance of their parents' wishes. 17-year-old Frederick from Sussex emigrated without his father's consent in 1867, and his father, previously categorised as drunken, visited the school objecting to his having gone. In 1882, Charles Young's father wrote very civilly to the school, inquiring whether 18-year-old Charles had gone of his own free will, as he had understood that his son had no wish to emigrate. Such a response, of course, was only to be expected in the circumstances, but Charles's letter to the school in 1883 seems to bear out the chaplain's version of events. Charles wrote, "Many thanks for the kindness you have done for me in getting me over here." The communication between Charles's father and the school revealed a difference between what Charles wanted and his father's knowledge of those wishes. Anna Davin has argued that the tensions and conflicts between children and parents can reveal the importance of age. Charles, at 17, was a young man, yet he was still his father's child with the emotional bonds that entailed. His failure to inform his father of his decision to emigrate could have reflected a desire on Charles's part not to directly confront his father's authority, but also a desire to escape the family hierarchy. Equally, the school's response revealed the prioritisation of Charles's wishes over those of his parents. This could have been because Charles's desires were congruent with those of the school, but the evidence of another child, Stephen's decision to enlist rather than emigrate as his father desired, would seem to indicate that the school took boys' wishes for their future seriously. This demonstrated an increasing recognition of the child as an independent citizen, separate from its parents. Another example is provided by the case of Albert Jurak. Two fascinating letters survive that indicate both the conflict between parental authority and child autonomy, and the extent to which concepts of citizenship were founded in parenthood. Albert was admitted into the school in 1891, aged 14. He had 2 previous convictions for stealing money and had been charged several times, including for stabbing his mother. He was a repeated truant, unable to read or write on admission, and had been taking the money his parents gave him to pay for school and spending it instead. After 4 years in the school, aged 18, Albert emigrated to Canada, supposedly to join his uncle, who had a farm there. Shortly after his departure in 1895, his father Samuel, a house painter, wrote to the school complaining that Albert had not arrived at his uncle's farm. And Samuel added, "If I do not get his address and know where to find him in the next 48 hours, I shall take other steps." Samuel did not list what those other steps would be, but he did make it clear that he would not forget to let the world at large know how they are treated and sent away, and the parents are kept in the dark. In making these threats, Samuel was asserting his rights as a parent and a citizen, and using the resources that he, as a relatively poor working-class man, had at his disposal. As Lydia Murdoch has demonstrated, parents were far from powerless in their relationships with institutions. They often turned to the police and magistrates to intervene, and if those failed, to the local press to raise public awareness and engender support. Samuel made a strong articulation of his parental rights. He proclaimed, "Do not forget that I did not give my consent for him to go away." At 19, Albert was considered in law able to seek out his own future and make his own decisions, as indeed it appears he had. But in the eyes of his father, he was a child still, under his father's control. Perhaps his presence in reformatory school long beyond the age of other formal schooling had created this impression. John Springhall has noted that the 19th century marked an institutionalisation of adolescence, and Davin has argued that exemption from work created an extension of childhood. Albert was occupying a liminal space, simultaneously a child in the eyes of his father and an adult in the terms of his citizenship. The school's response to Samuel Jurak's letter was one of instant indignation. The philanthropic abduction scandals that had brought Bernardo's organisation to the point of financial crisis in 1893, and the author of the letter clearly had this in mind. The school's letter clarified that Albert had been offered the opportunity of going to his uncle, which we should have preferred being a shorter distance to pay for, but that instead Albert had begged that he might go with two schoolfellows who were going to Wapella in Saskatchewan in Canada. It further asserted, "It is not only ridiculous, but you must know it is quite untrue. Your son has been sold like a slave." The school's assertions provide an important insight into the power dynamics between parents and institutions by the late 19th century. While boys' wishes for the future still took priority, the school also clearly felt under pressure to provide an explanation to working class parents that, as Sean Pooley and Lydia Murdoch have shown, had an increasingly clear sense of their own rights as citizens. The school wished to make it clear that it had not been financial motives that drove the decision, but Albert's own agency. As it had for Charles 13 years earlier, the school further asserted the primacy of Albert's choice, adding, "But for giving him a freedom which you appear to object to, he would have been sent to your brother, which, however, he declined." Albert, they added, was quite a free citizen in his new settlement, who could go where he liked, if he thinks he can do better for himself. Albert's status as an adult and a citizen therefore appeared unambiguous in the eyes of the school. However, it could equally have been positional and related to the school's comment to Samuel that Albert knew quite well what he decided to do when he took farewell of you. This pointed reminder that Albert had concealed his intentions questioned the parental bond that Samuel was trying to assert as the source of his authority over Albert, and strengthened the authority of the school as the repository of Albert's real desires. It was used to demonstrate the integrity of the school's actions in giving Albert a good chance of getting on in the world. In making the decision to emigrate, boys were influenced by staff at the school, but also by letters from existing emigrants. The records contain over 1,200 letters from boys at the school, published and unpublished, that demonstrate the role boy emigrants played in encouraging others to follow. These provide an invaluable insight into the influence that boys had on their former schoolmates' emigration. 16-year-old Albert Edmonds emigrated to Fredericton in New Brunswick in 1854, where he was placed with Dr. Riddell. He was a frequent correspondent with the school, and in a letter back in 1857, when he was 19, wrote, "I should advise every boy to come abroad that gets the chance." He added, "It was some time before I could make up my mind to come. Has it not been for Mr. Billcliffe," that was the farm bailiff at the RPS, "I suppose I should not be here now." In recruiting schoolfellows, many boys favoured those from their own house in the school. William Rosen, who had emigrated to Canada in 1863, aged 19, wrote to the school a year later, asking staff to send some more boys to join him. He stated, "I can get a couple of good places for 2 boys in the Waterlands," adding, "and if those boys that you send turn out well, I can get plenty of places." These examples of old boys who successfully emigrated served as advertisements to persuade others to follow. The letters from boys highlighted a wide range of themes that provide a powerful insight into boys' desire to emigrate. As for adult migrants, a chance for adventure, a fresh start, and material benefit all played a role. Unfortunately, today there's not enough time to explore any of these ideas, but they are considered in the wider project. Once out in the colonies, boys were not afraid to move jobs to find better paying work. Robert Herod is one such example. Having begun as a farm labourer, Robert moved to Montreal briefly, before apprenticing for 3 years as a cabinet maker in a small town in Quebec. Having learned his trade, however, he decided to migrate to Chicago, where he could earn better wages building the railroad. After 20 years there, he moved again to take a more senior job in Portland, Oregon, where he made millions as a bridge builder. While his wealth may have been unusual, Robert's mobility was far from unusual. As the slide shows, boys moved frequently, and 26% of the boys who emigrated to Canada from the RPS moved on to the United States in search of better wages or better weather. Another example of mobility is provided by William Henry Bishop, who was admitted just before his 14th birthday to the RPS in 1865. It is his third conviction of theft. William came from a respectable family in Margate, Kent, and the school described him as very intelligent on admission. He could already read, write and cipher well. Having initially said that he'd prefer William to come home at the end of his time, William's father, a master baker, wrote in early 1868 to say that there was now no place for William at home. William chose, therefore, to emigrate. He worked in various jobs in his first few years overseas. He began as a sawyer on a farm, but after a year of that, despite having a good relationship with his master and being offered double his wages to remain, he left that position. Instead, he apprenticed himself to a gentleman in Coaticook, who he wrote was going to start a paper. This venture proved unsuccessful, and a year later, in 1870, a letter from another boy revealed William to be working on the streetcars, selling newspapers. Having saved some money in that occupation, in 1871 William returned to Britain to visit friends and family. However, having spent all his money on his friends, he then had to borrow money from the RPS and another local charity to pay his return passage to Canada. Over the next 6 years, William worked in various jobs in various Quebec towns, including a return to his first employer. Marrying in 1875, he kept a milliner's shop with his wife. But when that was destroyed in a fire, he then took employment in yet another town, writing for a newspaper and selling books door to door in his spare time. Finally, in 1879, aged 28, William and his wife and child moved to Vermont in the United States, where he took a position as an editor and proprietor of the Essex County Herald, a job he retained until he died in 1911. Robert and William's geographic mobility and occupational instability was typical of emigrants and has traditionally been interpreted as a sign of unhappiness, particular to child migrants. However, as Laura Ishiguro has shown, middle-class and working-class settlers alike moved around Canada and the broader Anglo world in search of opportunity and places that they wanted to settle. The wealth of potential occupations combined with the fluctuating fortunes of various locations encouraged a mobility of both place and employment that was not generally available to boys' peers in Britain. Boys often wrote back to the school about their plans to try new places or go up country where they had heard of opportunities to make more money. Further evidence of boys' mobility was provided by the decision of around 20% of the boys who emigrated to return. Sometimes this was because they did not like the country. Other times it was because of the influence of friends or family back home. Such decisions did not always have positive consequences, as demonstrated by the example of Saxby and William, which opened this paper. Saxby had emigrated to Canada aged 14 in 1863. He was happy in his new home, describing it as the best home ever I had. However, after 4 years in Canada, he'd been persuaded by his younger brother William, who'd arrived in the country a short time earlier, to leave his master and return to England, with the unhappy consequences that we now know. Saxby's letter was full of regrets for his foolishness. He acknowledged that the school had warned boys that if any of them came back from Canada, it would be a judgment on them, and it as being on us, and that our own fault, he wrote. He added, with reference to his place in Canada, "Believe me, sir, I feel sorry now I left a good home, and I never had a better home, and never will as long as I live. It was the best home ever I had. I'm very sorry I have done it." The brief case studies in this paper illustrate several key themes that engage with current literature and child emigration. Through centering these boys' experiences, we can see that they were active participants in shaping their own futures, not passive victims. Firstly, it's clear from the evidence and from the wider review of files that the boys who emigrated from the RPS were doing so voluntarily. They were influenced not only by the school, but by their families and friends. Immigration was presented as an opportunity, and although there's not been any time today to discuss the information contained in the letters in any depth, within the bigger project, it's obvious that boys in England were well informed about the positives and negatives of life overseas. In choosing to emigrate, therefore, the boys were not being emigrated as is traditionally portrayed, they were making decisions about whether and where to go. The boys' decision to conceal these choices from the parents in some cases not only reveals their autonomy, but could also be indicative that they too shared the school's desire to remove themselves from the unhelpful influence of their relatives. Secondly, once in Canada, boys were often geographically mobile, but often this was in search of higher wages or a preferable location. And thirdly, as the case of William and Saxby shows, boys sometimes resisted the school's aims, returning to England with often unhappy consequences. In all of these ways, boys were shaping their own futures. And recognising this not only changes the narrative of philanthropic child emigration, but demands that we adapt and alter the lens through which we examine boys' outcomes. Boys spoke up about what they wanted and made choices about how they wanted their lives to unfold. Thank you.